I've always been a creature of habit. Every morning before work, I take a walk in the park near my apartment. It's my way of centering myself before the chaos of the day. That particular Tuesday morning, the air was crisp, the kind of cold that wakes you up and makes your breath visible. The park was quiet, except for the occasional jogger and a few dog walkers. As I rounded a bend near the duck pond, I noticed someone sitting on a bench, huddled under a tattered blanket. At first, I barely registered the figure. It wasn't uncommon to see people resting there, but something about this person caught my attention. It was the way they sat, shoulders hunched, head down, like they were carrying the weight of the world. I hesitated for a moment. I'm not someone who usually approaches strangers, let alone ones who seem troubled. But something pulled me toward that bench. "Good morning," I said cautiously as I approached. The figure looked up, revealing a man who couldn't have been more than 30. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but kind. He offered me a faint smile. "Morning," he replied, his voice barely audible. I gestured to the empty space on the bench. "Mind if I sit?" He shook his head, and I took a seat, unsure of what to say next. We sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the pond. Finally, I broke the ice. "Cold morning," I said, immediately regretting how banal it sounded. He chuckled softly. "Yeah. Not the worst, though." His tone was light, but there was an edge of sadness to it. I decided to take a chance. "I don't mean to pry," I said, "but are you okay?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Depends on your definition of okay." Over the next hour, he opened up in bits and pieces. His name was Liam, and he'd been living on the streets for about 6 months. A series of unfortunate events, a layoff, a medical emergency, and a falling out with his family, had left him with nowhere to go. "I'm not looking for pity," he said firmly. "I'll get back on my feet. It's just taking longer than I thought." There was a quiet determination in his voice that struck me. He wasn't wallowing in self-pity, he was fighting, even if the odds were against him. I asked him if he'd eaten that day. He shook his head, and I offered to grab us both some coffee and breakfast from the cafe across the street. When I returned, he thanked me like I'd handed him a winning lottery ticket. It was such a small gesture, but the gratitude in his eyes was overwhelming. We talked some more as we ate. Liam told me about his past, how he'd worked as a mechanic, his dreams of opening his own garage one day, and the series of misfortunes that had led him to this park bench. By the time I left for work, I couldn't stop thinking about Liam. His resilience and optimism, despite his circumstances, were inspiring. That evening, I returned to the park with a bag of warm clothes I no longer wore and some toiletries. Liam was still there, and his face lit up when he saw me. "I don't want to overstep," I said, handing him the bag. "But I thought these might help." He accepted the bag with a grateful smile. "You don't know what this means to me," he said. Over the next few weeks, I made a habit of stopping by the park to check on Liam. Sometimes we'd just sit and talk, other times, I'd bring him a hot meal or something he needed. In those conversations, I learned more about him than I ever expected. He was funny, insightful, and surprisingly optimistic. "People are kinder than you'd think," he said one day. "I've met some real jerks, sure, but I've also met people like you. It's what keeps me going." One day, Liam wasn't at the bench. I worried something had happened to him, but a week later, I found a note tucked under a rock where he usually Saturday. It read, "Thank you for everything. I found a spot at a shelter, and they're helping me get back on my feet. I'll never forget your kindness." Liam. Months passed, and life went on. I often wondered what had become of Liam. Then, one afternoon, as I was walking through the same park, someone called my name. I turned to see a well-dressed man waving at me. It took a moment to recognize him, but there he was, Liam, looking healthier and happier than ever. He told me he'd found a job at a local garage and was saving up to rent his own place. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. That encounter with Liam changed the way I see the world. It reminded me that small acts of kindness can have a ripple effect, reaching far beyond what we can see. Liam taught me that resilience and hope can flourish even in the toughest of circumstances. And he showed me that sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you to make all the difference. I still take my morning walks in the park, and every time I pass that bench, I think of Liam. I like to imagine him thriving, building the life he dreamed of, and maybe even sitting on a different bench somewhere, sharing his story with someone else who needs to hear it. Second story. If you've ever driven cross-country, you know how simultaneously liberating and terrifying it can be. Long stretches of highway, endless horizons, and the constant hum of the engine create this strange mix of tranquility and anxiety. You're alone, fully reliant on your car, and every mile feels like a small victory. Last summer, I decided to take a solo road trip across the Midwest. It wasn't for any grand reason, no soul-searching mission or bucket list checkmark. I just wanted a break from my routine and a chance to see the country beyond my suburban bubble. I planned everything meticulously, my route, pit stops, and even backup motels in case I couldn't make it to my planned destination each night. But as with most things in life, my carefully laid plans went out the window about halfway through the trip. I was somewhere in Nebraska, driving down a 2-lane road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The scenery was beautiful in its simplicity, rolling fields, the occasional barn, and a sky so blue it felt surreal. Then, it happened. A loud clunk, followed by a series of unsettling noises from my car's engine. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart sinking. Smoke began to rise from under the hood, and I knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I had any idea what I was looking at. Spoiler, I didn't. My phone had 1 bar of service, just enough to call for roadside assistance. After 20 minutes of being on hold, I was informed that the nearest tow truck was over 2 hours away. Great! So there I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no shade, no service, and no idea what to do next. Just as I was about to settle in for a long wait, a beat-up pickup truck pulled over in front of my car. My initial reaction was caution. I mean, I'd seen enough horror movies to know how this could end. But then a middle-aged man in a grease-stained baseball cap stepped out, waving. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice thick with a southern drawl. His name was Dale, and he looked like he'd stepped straight out of a small-town diner ad, plaid shirt, worn jeans, and a kind smile that made me feel slightly less nervous. "I'm no mechanic," I admitted, "but something's definitely wrong with the engine." Dale leaned under the hood, poking around like he'd done this 100 times before. After a few minutes, he shook his head. "You've got a busted radiator. This ain't going anywhere without some serious repairs." He offered to tow me to his friend's garage in the nearby town of Ash Creek, about 15 miles away. Given my lack of options, I reluctantly agreed. The tow was slow, and the truck's air conditioning was barely functional, but Dale kept the conversation light. He told me about Ash Creek, a town of just over 1,000 people, where everyone knew everyone. When we arrived, I expected a rundown shop with rusty tools and questionable service. Instead, I found a clean, well-organized garage run by a man named Tom, who greeted Dale like an old friend. "Radiator's shot," Dale explained. "Think you can get her back on the road?" Tom nodded. "Might take a day or two to get the part, but we'll fix her up." And that's how I found myself stuck in Ash Creek for 48 hours. At first, I was frustrated. My schedule was ruined, and I had no idea what to do in a town with one diner, a post office, and a gas station. But Dale wouldn't hear of me sulking. "You're our guest now," he said, handing me a plate of barbecue at his backyard cookout that evening. "Might as well make the best of it." Over the next 2 days, Dale and his family treated me like one of their own. His wife, Linda, insisted on feeding me every meal, while their teenage daughter, Ellie, gave me a tour of the town, which included her favorite fishing spot by the creek. The people of Ash Creek welcomed me with open arms. By the time Tom called to say my car was ready, I felt more like a friend than a visitor. Dale refused to let me pay him for the tow, saying, "Just pass it on next time you see someone in need." As I drove away from Ash Creek, I couldn't help but feel a little emotional. What started as a frustrating breakdown turned into a heartwarming reminder of the kindness of strangers. Weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from Ellie, thanking me for listening to her dreams about leaving Ash Creek for college. She said I'd inspired her to believe that the world outside their small town was worth exploring. That trip taught me more than I could have imagined. It reminded me that plans are just guidelines, and the best experiences often come from the unexpected. It also showed me the power of community and how even the smallest acts of kindness can leave a lasting impact. Now, every time I hit the road, I carry a little piece of Ash Creek with me. I keep a toolbox in my trunk and a vow to always pay forward the kindness that Dale, Linda, and the people of Ash Creek showed me when I needed it most. Third story. I didn't consider myself much of a volunteer. It wasn't that I didn't care about my community, I just always assumed someone else would handle the issues that needed fixing. That mindset changed last fall, and I haven't looked at my town the same way since. It all started with a flyer. I'd been walking home from the coffee shop when I noticed a neon green sheet of paper pinned to the bulletin board near the entrance. Community Cleanup Day, it announced in bold letters, with a cartoon drawing of a trash bag and a rake. I almost walked past it, but something made me pause. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was boredom. Either way, I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the flyer. The event was scheduled for the following Saturday, starting at 9 a.m. at Willow Park. Willow Park was a place I avoided. Once a vibrant hub for families, it had fallen into disrepair over the years. Broken swings, graffiti-covered benches, and overgrown weeds had turned it into a ghost of its former self. It was the kind of place you hurried past at night, hoping not to run into anyone. But that Saturday morning, armed with gloves, a trash bag, and a reusable water bottle, I found myself standing among a group of about 20 other volunteers in the park's cracked parking lot. Most of them were older, retirees, judging by their casual conversation about grandkids and gardening. A few younger faces, like mine, dotted the crowd, but everyone seemed equally unsure of what to expect. A woman in a bright orange vest, who introduced herself as Deb, handed out maps of the park divided into zones. "Stick to your assigned area," she said. "And if you find anything dangerous, needles, broken glass, that sort of thing, let one of us know." I was assigned to Zone C, a stretch of land behind the rusted jungle gym that led down to a small creek. It was secluded, shaded by trees that hadn't been trimmed in years, and littered with everything from beer bottles to old sneakers. I set to work, the repetitive motion of picking up trash oddly calming. It wasn't until I reached the creek that things took an unexpected turn. At first, I thought it was just more garbage, a pile of old blankets, some empty cans, and a shopping cart tipped on its side. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't just trash. It was someone's home. A makeshift shelter had been constructed under the bridge, complete with a tarp roof and a small stack of canned goods neatly arranged next to a propane stove. I froze. I wasn't sure what to do. Was someone living here? Were they nearby? As if on cue, a man's voice called out from behind me. "Hey! Can I help you with something?" I turned to see a man in his 50s standing a few feet away, holding a fishing pole. His clothes were worn but clean, and his expression was wary but not unkind. I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered. "I'm here for the cleanup project." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Name's Joe. This is my spot. Been here for a while now." Joe wasn't what I expected. He was articulate, polite, and seemed genuinely curious about the cleanup effort. He told me he'd been living under the bridge for nearly 2 years after losing his job and, eventually, his house. "People don't come down here much," he said, gesturing to the overgrown creek. "Out of sight, out of mind, I guess." We talked for nearly an hour. Joe told me about the small community of unhoused individuals who lived in and around Willow Park. Most of them kept to themselves, trying to avoid trouble. He spoke about the challenges they faced: lack of resources, constant judgment, and the ever-present fear of being forced to leave. By the time I returned to the parking lot, my trash bag was full, but my mind was even fuller. I couldn't stop thinking about Joe and the others he'd mentioned. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I researched local resources for unhoused individuals. What I found shocked me. My town, despite its outward appearance of prosperity, had very little infrastructure to support people like Joe. The following week, I reached out to Deb, the cleanup organizer. I wanted to know if there was more we could do for the people living in and around the park. Deb was hesitant at first. "It's a delicate issue," she said. "Not everyone's going to be on board with helping them. Some folks just want them gone." But she agreed to help me organize a meeting with other volunteers and community leaders. The meeting was a turning point. We discussed ways to provide immediate aid, like food and clothing drives, as well as longer-term solutions, like advocating for affordable housing and mental health resources. Joe even came to one of the meetings, sharing his story with a room full of people who might have otherwise ignored him. His honesty and courage moved everyone, including me. Over the next few months, things started to change. The town approved a small budget for park maintenance and outreach programs. A local church began offering free meals on weekends, and a group of volunteers started a mobile clinic for basic medical care. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Looking back, I'm amazed at how much that one day of volunteering changed my life. It taught me that small actions, like picking up trash, can lead to big changes. It also reminded me that every community has its struggles, hidden just beneath the surface. All it takes is one moment, one conversation, to bring those issues into the light. Now, every time I pass Willow Park, I see more than just a patch of land. I see a symbol of what's possible when people come together, not just to clean up, but to care.